Please now welcome Vanessa Hernandez, co-chair of the Access to Justice Conference.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the third and final day of the ATJ conference. My name is Vanessa Torres Hernandez, and I have the great honor, along with the fabulous Jaime Cuevas, of being one of the co-chairs of this year's conference planning committee. I'd like to start the day out with thanks to the members of the conference planning committee whose names are on page 22 of your program. Their vision and collaboration made all of this possible. On day 3, I'd like to start us out with the words of Mariame Kaba, an abolitionist and brilliant community organizer who wrote my favorite book of the summer, We Do This Till We Free Us. In it, she brilliantly articulates a vision of social transformation in which nobody is left behind. And she also reminds us that nothing that we do that is worthwhile is done alone. Nothing that we do that is worthwhile is done alone. She puts it another way, everything worthwhile is done together. Our keynote speaker this morning, Michele Storms, has devoted her career to effective, community-centered, and inclusive legal advocacy. Michele serves as the executive director of the ACLU of Washington, where she leads the charge to push for full realization of the constitutional rights of all Americans, and where she guides the ACLU in its efforts to center equity, and racial equity in particular, in its advocacy and operations. Like so many of the attorneys attending this conference, Michele has her roots in civil legal aid. She began her career as a staff attorney and then statewide advocacy coordinator at Columbia Legal Services and the Northwest Justice Project. She served on the Washington State Access to Justice Board for 6 years and received KCBA's Outstanding Lawyer Award in 2018, among many other well-deserved honors. But those of us who are lucky enough to have worked with Michele know what can't be reproduced on a resume. Michele is a master at building inclusive spaces. She leads from her values, and you can always trust Michele to act in accordance with the principles she espouses. Michelle's invested in cultivating the leadership of those around her. She listens, she asks questions, she facilitates process where people come to the right result together. The skills that Michele brings are the skills we all need to cultivate so that we can do the worthwhile work together. In this truly unprecedented moment in our nation's history, we can work together to build a legal system that's equitable, inclusive, and truly deserves to be called a justice system. And Michele's one of the leaders who can help take us there. Without further delay, the truly amazing Michele Storms.
Good morning, my dear friends. You have spent the past 2 days grappling with the truth of our unjust systems. You have examined institutional racism and how it shows up in the courts, where justice is too often denied, and in our social services systems, which are meant to help and heal, but which too often stigmatize, minimize, and reinforce trauma. You have examined issues of racism, gender justice, immigrant rights, youth rights, disability rights, and in particular, you have looked at where these systems are failing, and you've been talking about the work towards systems transformation. This morning, I'm also thinking about this big picture of where we have been and where we are as a country, and about the many systems that operate daily, either to the benefit or detriment of us, depending on our identities and our work. I want to explore with you what we need to think about if we really want to see the transformation we so desire, the true belongingness that we are currently still so far away from. I speak to you not as the person who has all the answers, because I don't. I speak to you humbly as a seeker along with you for a better future. We are in times of deep division and deep trauma, and not only must we press forward toward a future in which each of us in all our myriad identities belongs, we must do so together somehow. Majority systems, wealth, corporate, white, and other forms of supremacy will do all they can to maintain supremacy and power, including the work to divide those of us seeking to overcome forms of supremacy. In these times of division, fear, and uncertainty, it's possible to engage in oppression Olympics, or as powerful disability rights advocate Carrie Bassas called it yesterday, I think, misery competition, all of which divides us further. It's something we have to fight against with every fiber of our beloved beings. So here are the thoughts I want to share today. First, establish some shared assumptions about what we're dealing with. Talk about the role of our own personal histories in this imperative to take action. Focus on the moment we are in 2021, and this personal, interpersonal, organizational, community, societal, structural, institutional work we're called upon to do, and the challenges inherent in that. Most importantly, I want to talk about dismantling harmful systems without dismantling ourselves. And finally, how we bridge a path to belonging. So starting with some shared assumptions for the purposes of this talk, first, that we have a shared goal of belongingness for everyone, something beyond inclusion and equity, a table created by and for all, a sense of beloved community as envisioned by Martin Luther King and many others, or as John Powell would say, belonging entails being respected at a level that includes the right to both contribute and make demands upon society and political and cultural institutions. Second, we don't have belongingness. Living in the United States, we're constantly swimming in the poisonous waters of racism, patriarchy, ableist systems. Sadly, our society was built on exclusion. Our founding institutions were built on multiple original sins, including the genocide of Indigenous people and the stealing of their lands and culture, the enforced chattel slavery of Black people brought forcibly from the continent of Africa and trafficked throughout the Americas, inferiorizing of women and also of men without money, land, or suitably masculine traits. And of course, these original sins have blossomed over the years into additional isms, Orientalism, or the othering and exoticizing of non-white, non-Christian peoples, largely from Asia and the Middle East, ableism, and all other isms and phobias. We have immigrant policies which have excluded people who are non-European, non-white, non-Christian in our current day, with a special, sadly, exclusionary focus on our neighbors south of the border and those who practice Islam. Also, we have criminal legal system policies which, from policing to sentencing to mass incarceration, single out Black and brown peoples in particular. Healthcare systems cater to the needs of majority culture, but which ignore the needs of those who don't fit that mold. That's what we're living in. This evidence is writ large throughout our history. These exclusions were not accidental, they were intentional. I wish it weren't true, and it's hard to grapple with, but it's in the legislative records, it's in the newspaper articles, it is in the firsthand accounts of so many people, from the slave narratives to the firsthand accounts of Indigenous peoples, migrant farm worker stories, immigrant stories. It's in court cases, and it's in the stories our grandparents and great-grandparents and aunts and uncles have told us. And also, I point your attention to the Who We Are project, which gives you so much more detail about our founding institutions, and that's cited in my materials. So the evidence is right in front of us. Meanwhile, in states across the country, legislatures are literally outlawing the teaching of critical race theory. They're outlawing the teaching of the full truth, or as one meme I saw recently said, outlawing critical race theory while maintaining Confederate statues and histories is hypocritical race theory. Failing to teach the perspectives of all peoples, their experiences, and the truthful record of our history is a disservice to all of us. Knowing the truth allows us to heal, to rectify, and to be in genuine community with each other. Here is one more premise on which all else I share is founded. This exclusion, this racism, sexism, transphobia, ableism, xenophobia, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and all else that has flowed from these original exclusions of all who are not white, straight, and rich, has harmed every single one of us. Yes, including the inner favored circle. Every single one of us bears the scars and the trauma, generationally and presently, of this exclusion. Those in the favored group spend whole lifetimes trying to uphold and defend a system and structures they deeply and innately know are wrong, or else they struggle from the guilt of complicity. And if you're on the outside of the circle, then you're in a constant lifetime struggle to overcome generations of hatred, of fear, also the lack of wealth, lack of opportunity. At the level of our very DNA, all of us are in pain and trauma, and it's past time for healing. So we start with our own stories on this journey. Who am I to be saying anything about any of this? Well, I'm a Black woman of primarily African descent. My ancestors in this country were held in bondage during the institution of chattel slavery in this country, and my ancestors were overcomers. When my maternal grandmother was born outside Jackson, Mississippi in 1920, she was born into poverty so deep she didn't eat every day. She worked as young as 8 years old, cleaning the houses of white families. As a poor Black woman growing up in the South, she experienced abuse at every level, emotional, physical, sexual, just in the effort to go to adulthood, which she did, and then courageously carried her family from Mississippi, first to Chicago, in search of better economic circumstances and better acceptance, and not finding it there, left the projects of Chicago to come to California, where I was born. And I want to say about my grandmother, who we all knew as dear, that she was as creative and beautiful and strong and smart as anyone you ever met. She could sing like a bird and play piano by ear. She was also capable of taking any piece of fabric and turning it into a dress, a hat, a decorative furniture covering, anything, without a pattern, without formal training, with just an eye for beauty and innate creativity. Even as I recite the history that she was one of the many thousands of Black people who traveled the noted African-American migration from the South to other parts of the country, she was also an individual with a story, a precious life, an identity. And as we think about the many thousands who are still journeying through racism and poverty, survivors of violence and discrimination, those migrating inside the country or from outside this country with a hope of better life inside it, those migrating from inside prison walls to the world outside, every one of them has a story and is a beautiful and worthy person. We are fighting for beautiful, worthy persons to live with freedom and dignity. As I share about only one of my many ancestors and their struggles, I invite you to consider your own ancestors, what they overcame, how you got to where you are. And as you reflect on the legacy left to you, perhaps the most important thing to consider, what legacy will you leave for those who follow you? In my case, here I was, the first in my family born on the West Coast. Finally, in California, the family hope for a better way began to be realized as my family pulled itself, with help and aid from governmental and charitable programs, out of poverty. And yet still my early years were filled with incidents of racism, classism, and exclusion also. From the kindergarten teacher who refused to let me, the only Black child in her class, use the bathroom that the other children used, to being denied health care at an emergency room when I was sick because we didn't have insurance or adequate cash on hand. When I think now about what it means to my ancestors that I've been a civil legal aid lawyer, fighting for people without adequate income, and that I now lead an organization dedicated to the mission of protecting and expanding civil rights and civil liberties for all people, you know, it takes my breath away. So many of my relatives needed what I and all of you here have dedicated our lives to: inclusion under the law, access to the things a person needs to survive, and all the guarantees of the Constitution. We're still here fighting because it's not true yet. Everyone can't get the help they need. There are still too many children like my grandmother who are growing up hungry. There are too many children who, like me, are mistreated in school because of their identity. Now that could be race, or being transgender, or living with a disability, or being a non-English speaker. It's still wrong. A visual scan of all the tents planted around freeways and in parks will tell you that too. The people in fear of the evictions to come post-moratorium can tell you that. People do not get the services they need, and certainly also do not get the legal help they need. And the legal help they can get is still subject to the courts and the precedents that have been based in various forms of supremacy and norms that exclude too many of us, not considering our differences, our needs, our histories, and the many forms of oppression that can get in the way of progress. Justice? Not yet. Well, here we are in 2021. It's hard to believe it has been a quarter century since the very first Access to Justice conference. So much has happened since then. The footprint of legal services delivery has shifted multiple times in the past 25 years. The relationship between legal aid organizations and grassroots organizations and bar associations has deepened and grown. More of us are coming together in solidarity than ever before, and there is hope in that. There are other changes, not all positive. Chief among them, we're still living in a global pandemic, and it's not going away anytime soon. Our last ATJ conference was before COVID, so we were able to meet in person in Spokane. Now we're all home behind our screens. And while some offices and organizations remained open throughout, braving sickness because of the imperative to serve our communities, other offices and types of businesses are now starting to reopen, or they reopened and they're closing again as mutating variants of the coronavirus gain more traction and make more people sicker faster with greater lethality. Just this week, we topped 500,000 coronavirus cases in Washington state. Sobering. And last year, another signal moment in time, the murder of George Floyd. Obviously, not the first time by far that an unarmed Black man was killed by police. This 9+ minutes of brutal torture as a precious man's life was snuffed out while we all watched in horror, while Derek Chauvin, with practically a smile on his face, held his knee to Mr. Floyd's neck. There could be no greater symbolism of the continuing struggle against racial injustice than to see a white man empowered by state authority with his actual knee on the actual neck of a Black man, stealing his actual life from his body. The historic, massive, global anti-racism protests ignited by the murder of George Floyd at the hands of the state have landed us squarely in the collective anti-oppression space that Professor Kendi has called the end of denial. That is, the denial that white supremacy and systemic racism exist. What now? Locally, nearly every equity and justice entity and partner, starting with our own Washington State Supreme Court's June 4th, 2020 letter, has issued pro-equity anti-racism declarations. The Supreme Court's letter has so much in it that I love, but in part it says this: the devaluation and degradation of Black lives is not a recent event. It is a persistent and systemic injustice that predates this nation's founding. But recent events have brought to the forefront of our collective consciousness a painful fact that is for too many of our citizens common knowledge. The injustices faced by Black Americans are not relics of the past. We continue to see racialized policing and the overrepresentation of Black Americans in every stage of our criminal and juvenile justice systems. The legal community must recognize that we all bear responsibility for this ongoing injustice, and we are capable of taking steps to address it, if only we have the courage and the will. The injustice still plaguing our country has its roots in the individual and collective actions of many, and it cannot be addressed without the individual and collective actions of all of us. Because many of us have spent much of our lives, however young or old we may be, as part of a small band of equity and justice anti-oppression advocates, there's something almost surreal about having much of society rise up to join in under the leadership of Black Lives Matter and other community-led movement leaders. What has happened is that we are now offered an unprecedented disruptive moment in which we can leverage all that we've learned so far in the course of our equity and justice efforts. We have a great opportunity for change. That said, we recognize the current backlash against pro-equity, anti-racism movement building work has been fierce and deadly. The redoubled efforts to curtail the voting rights of people, most notably people of color, immigrant communities, people without money, the attempts to ensure education is fully whitewashed, as I noted earlier, some states outlawing the teaching of the 1619 Project in critical race theory. An educator in Tennessee was actually fired for assigning readings by Ta-Nehisi Coates. We are in a dangerous time. Supremacy wants to stay dominant and will do all in its power to maintain itself. Supremacy wants to stay dominant and will do all in its power to maintain itself. Today's structural oppression is intractably rooted in history, In spite of efforts to deny the stolen humanity of Blacks, Indigenous people, and other people of color, the trauma caused is intergenerational and cumulative. It can't be unseen, for the truth finds a way to be revealed, whether through the devastating disparities revealed by COVID-19, the newly uncovered mass graves of Indigenous children, and you know there will be many more mass graves found, or the unearthed California Chinatown once razed to the ground. The stakes are high. It's imperative that we, as an equity and justice community and movement, mobilize to take fullest possible advantage of the strong winds of change at our back, because these winds will not blow in our favor for long, because once again, the dominant status quo always does all in its power to make the duration of the disruption be as short as possible, so that we can just go back to life as we have known it. And I know I keep saying that, but it's true. And we have to work hard against it. After these sessions you've attended, you've been hearing about policing and excessive and biased discipline in schools, people's struggles to remain housed or to get housed, the unnecessarily cruel treatment of our incarcerated siblings and their barriers to success upon leaving the carceral system. All of this is the various forms of supremacy doing all it can to maintain its supremacy, power, and control. And that is what we have to overcome. To overcome a harmful system rooted in history and in every structure that governs our lives, our work then must touch at all these levels: personal, interpersonal, organizational, community, societal. So no wonder it's exhausting. Currently, many of our organizations are doing race equity work, and that is good. And if you're not, you should, because if we don't confront the truth of our past history and how it impacts us today, we will actually just work 24 hours a day and 7 days a week and still change nothing, because we haven't addressed the structures that will never, as they are currently constructed, allow for full inclusion of all of us. If you've not started this work, I encourage your attention on the book Trust the Process, about Columbia Legal Services' ongoing story of becoming anti-racist. I also know there's a workshop coming up on August 18th covering that in more detail, so attend that if you can. I know that some are afraid to dig deeply into such work. They've heard stories of organizations struggling, relationships strained, things getting chaotic. And the fact that the work never seems to end, because like no one seems to have achieved race equity nirvana in their organization. At the ACLU of Washington, we made a commitment about 3 years ago to do this deep race equity work. We recognized we were an organization doing powerful work in the community, often fighting battles for racial justice externally. And yet when we looked within, we realized we had our own work to do to come to deeper understanding and better practices. We'd all been to numerous trainings, but we wanted more. We wanted to know how we could operationalize the racial equity work and have it be ingrained in us in every decision at every level, and how we could be better responsive to the needs of people most directly impacted by racism and other forms of oppression, instead of marching in as the smart lawyers telling folks what to do. We started with a 2+ day retreat with amazing facilitators, and I highly recommend launching with a retreat. It's actually an imperative to take time away with your teams and be together in a learning atmosphere. If it's available to you, skilled facilitators are worth more than their weight in gold. Following our own intensive retreat, our facilitators worked with our race equity team to build out a written roadmap for how we would continue to create change in our organization. And from that work, we created a race equity lens, which we still use to guide decisions on everything from HR policies to what cases we'll take. We created subcommittees so that people throughout the office are working on different aspects of this roadmap, reviewing our policies or ensuring our training and education is ongoing. Other staff are testing tools for equitable meetings, for example, so that we stay strong in the work. Yes, it is marvelous, and it's sometimes horrible, because sometimes we disagree, we get it wrong, we get frustrated, we operate out of our baggage, we get off course, and then we self-correct, and it's all worth it. The building of deeper relationships, the long work of building trust, the development of shared vision is worth all the struggles, because even though we're not yet there, we're on the road to something good. Dr. Leticia Nieto shares that the chaos and disruption are indications that you're doing something, making progress. Again, Our systems and our structures are so ingrained that no matter your identity, and I can tell you this, as a Black person, I fall into patterns based in and normed to people who aren't even like me, because that's the world I've grown up in, personally and professionally. That's the poisonous water and the implicit unconscious bias and brain associations that every one of us lives with. The work is truly personal, and that's where it has to start. Each of us has to come to grips with our own identities. And again, we have intersecting myriad identities. Each of us has to confront the awfulness as what has happened in our collective history, in our personal histories connected to the collective of histories. And we each individually have to commit to a change in our own hearts every day, and a commitment to continue forward even when we feel terribly bruised. The truth is, the more you confront, the more bruised you feel. And it's natural to have a period of feeling kind of awful, but if you ignore the truth, bruises stay. If you confront, bruises can heal. The organizational level work I've spoken about, I shared ACLU's story, I've referenced the journey of Columbia Legal Services. We have this amazing organization in our state, Just Lead Washington, that is literally here to help us all navigate this journey. The Leadership Academy they run, the resources on their website are invaluable. As a graduate of the Leadership Academy Cohort 2, shout out to Cohort 2 members, and having seen the many cohorts that have followed, I can tell you it's an amazing resource. And for myself, I'm no longer personally willing to work in an organization that's not in process of confronting how racism and ableism and all the isms and phobias are part of their existence and are actively at work to overcome these exclusionary ways. Beyond Just Lead, there are so many others helping our organizations walk this path toward greater equity. Majors Leadership, Reverb DEI, Rise with KJ, Epiphanies of Equity, Racial Equity Consultants, and so many others. And I'm grateful that our own state Supreme Court has again demonstrated leadership, forming a racial justice consortium to coordinate judicial branch efforts around racial justice. It's vital work and proof the court meant business when they sent that letter on June 4th, more than a year ago. People, we will transform our system of justice in Washington state. When you do this work, you're not alone. So let's confront this. How do we dismantle systems without dismantling ourselves? So those fears of implosion and discord, yes, there's a cautionary warning here. Because of our exclusionary past and present, there is trauma-induced and toxic horizontal and internalized oppression that Blacks, Indigenous, and people of color experience. BIPOC communities and other marginalized communities fight with one another in this degenerative space of I've suffered more than you, or I too have suffered. And then there's the guilt and shame that white people experience. We can get in a hellish trap of continually pushing on the bruises to see if they're still there, and once confirming their presence, staying mad, and that's not productive. It's why the personal work and the interpersonal work is so important, because we have to be in healthy relationship with ourselves and with each other. The community work can't effectively get done if we're all in our own forms of personal and interpersonal chaos. Please listen to this. We cannot change overall structures if we're at each other's throats or if we're experiencing self-doubt. Supremacy wins if we're fighting each other. Do you hear me? Supremacy wins if we're fighting each other. Because if we're fighting amongst ourselves, external conditions will not change. The wealthy will stay wealthy. Our systems will still cater to those of privilege, and we'll have missed our chance to make change. My colleague, Tony Davis, says, call yourself out before you call someone else out. Think about that for a minute. And she added, don't call people out if you're not calling them in. She's right. We have to check ourselves, and each of us has to call the other in more so than out, even though it is hard. The ancient proverb says, to go fast, go alone, but to go far, go together. That means no shortcuts and no giving up, hand in hand or not at all. We are in a particular time. Politically, the country is so divided that many of us believe completely different versions of pretty much everything. We have experienced an attempt to topple democracy itself with an insurrection at the Capitol building earlier this year, and we continue to watch and wait to see whether there will be meaningful accountability or whether the pump is simply primed for additional attempts to thwart democracy with violence. In the face of evidence that elections have been safe and sound, there's an attack on voting rights and voting integrity at great risk that people will fail to trust these systems going forward. Oh, that would be supremacy maintaining itself. The cost of all this turmoil at the national level is people's lives, livelihoods, and psyches. We are in the movement moment with opportunity to transform that which is harmful. The author of Emergent Strategy, Adrienne Marie Brown, says movements tend to become the practice ground for what we're healing toward, co-creating. Movements are responsible for embodying what we are inviting into our people into. We need the people within our movements, all socialized into and by unjust systems, to be on liberators' paths, not already free, but practicing freedom every day, not already beyond harm, but accountable for doing our individual and internal work to end harm and engage in generative conflict, which includes actively working to gain awareness of the ways we can and have harmed each other, where we have significant political differences, and where we can end cycles of harm and unprincipled struggles in ourselves and our communities. So brilliant. So let's talk about bridging this path to belonging. We're in the home stretch. Our aspirations for all people to belong in all spaces. The reality is we don't have it. The work we're called to do is to make it real, doing our internal, interpersonal, and organizational work, and then the external work, fighting carceral systems, governmental overreach and discrimination, oppression, patriarchy, supremacy. And we have to do this. All those billionaires out there not paying their taxes, they're not going to do it. We have to. So here are some cornerstones for us to think about. First, we must be community-led and accountable. Our work must be in solidarity with and accountability to those communities most harmed by structural racism and other forms of oppression, who know best what must change, and yet who are often furthest from power to effectuate change. As Brian Stevenson said, we must be in proximity with communities in need and follow their lead. To do this work with integrity, we have to center their voices, listen carefully. Our work then becomes about throwing our elbows out and inserting ourselves into this disruptive space, doing everything we can to hold it open until durable transformational change has been made. Did you hear Mateen speaking at the Black Prisoner Caucus keynote yesterday? He said, fall back and play your position. Follow the lead of those with lived experience. Gerard Bozeman on the same panel said, it's intentional daily work. Okay, second, we have to dismantle our silos. What we've learned from the confluence of COVID-19 and the globe bearing witness to George Floyd's murder under the dehumanizing, abusive, and racist power of the state was the need to dismantle the law and justice system silos that operate in ways to gravely amplify harm, especially to BIPOC and other marginalized communities. These silos include the civil, juvenile, criminal, and child welfare systems, among others. And I'm thankful that in this access to justice community, there's been a commitment to that work, and that must continue. We also have to avoid the trap of false dichotomies. This idea that you that you can't work within the system, you have to break the system down. Well, you can work in the system and externally to the system. You can have impact work and direct service work. We have to build solidarity and collective commitment to simultaneous engagement in pro-equity, anti-racism change work. There's one eye on the long-term creation of durable transformational change. There's another eye on the work that is reforming to reduce harm and suffering in the meantime while we await the long-term transformative change. And finally, we have to be present to the prevention and mitigation of harm and suffering in this present moment. So it's not whether we do long haul work or short-term work or whether we do impact versus direct. You have to do all of it all the time. And luckily for us, there are so many of us who can do different pieces of the work that we can get it done. And every single one of those pieces of work has value. No dichotomy. We need it all. So the reminder that while we dismantle systems, we can't dismantle ourselves. Adrienne Marie Brown actually wrote a whole book on this too, called We Will Not Cancel Us and Other Dreams of Transformative Justice. Radical change requires radical forgiveness and acceptance. As activists and change leaders, all of us, we have to take on the powerful and hold them accountable, but we have to remember not to attack our own allies and friends. We can call each other in when we make mistakes, but we need every one of us in these fights for equity and justice. All of us at times are going to make mistakes. We have to forgive each other and help set each other right kindly. James Baldwin said something along the lines of America's always changing, but it never changes. And I want to add to that, that unless we consciously and intentionally work to change it, we can't give up. Even if for every 3 steps forward, there are 2 steps back, we must continue onward. And we owe that to those who've come before us, and we surely owe it to those coming after us. So to really wrap up here, I have some messages, some direct messages for those of you in different roles in this work. Okay, to those of you who are in leadership in organizations fighting for justice, lawyers, judges, whoever you are, don't stop fighting. No one is going to thank you or appreciate you, so let that go. But do your level best to create workplaces and courts and systems that are kind and fair. Be countercultural all the time. Question every day whether you're falling back into systems of supremacy, and then redouble your efforts to do otherwise. Your rest and self-care are critical. And remember that just because you have the title doesn't mean you aren't a part of a team. This work is done in concert with others. Remember, there are people who are leaders who don't have titles, and yet they're fighting the battles too, and they're often living the battles in ways you are not. Respect them, hear them, follow them. And remember that power dynamics are present in every situation with clients, colleagues, partners, and so on. It's often hard to see how power flows when you have it. Be mindful, be kind. And specifically to those titled leaders whose identities are from marginalized communities, I see you. I know you are overcoming forms of supremacy and trying to knock them down and live within them, and you're facing discrimination, you're being misunderstood, and your brilliance denied. And I've been there too. Above all, do not give up. To you leaders without title who are fighting for your communities every day, don't stop fighting. You're definitely underappreciated and undervalued, and I am so sorry that's true. But you are the heart of the movement. You are the heart of change. You are living it every day, and for you, it is truly imperative that you take rest and care. You are a part of a long line of powerful activists, the Fannie Lou Hamers and Winona LaDukes, the Sylvia Riveras, the Hanani K. Trasks, and so many others of so many identities, often whose names we will never know. Please seek out support and community for yourself so that you can be resourced for the long work ahead of you. And I also ask you to be kind to the titled leaders I was just talking to. They have complex challenges on their plates that are not always visible. Especially be kind to leaders from marginalized communities who face double trouble trying to tackle supremacy while being subject to it, same as you. On the good days and the difficult days, all these leaders are your friends and partners. And of course, above all, do not give up. Now, to anyone and everyone who seeks a better world, do not stop fighting. There is not a person alive who does not have a role to play in achieving equity and justice and belonging in this world. Whether your role is to better understand your privilege or to better understand your pain, whether you will march at the rally, write your legislator, donate funds, or silently hold hope, you are vital. Remember to vote like your rights depend on it. And know you also need rest, care, and joy. Never giving up doesn't mean denying your own needs and humanity, but instead showing up as your full exquisite self as much as you can. So now to every single person, regardless of your position or role, remember, please ensure and center the trauma and experiences of people of color. Our Black Prisoners Caucus members shared on this so exquisitely yesterday. The systems have been stacked against too many, and as a justice community, we are not doing it right if people of color and other marginalized communities are not leaders in this work. I also ask you to make space for joy and playfulness because we literally cannot live without joy and play, period. Make time for it. It's every bit as important as the work. Joy and radical rest are required for us to be resourced enough to contribute to the world we aspire to. I also ask you to stop scarcity mentality. There is enough for all. There actually really is enough for all. And finally, just because we have not overcome yet doesn't mean we won't. Remember the words of the Hopi. We are the ones we are waiting for. Therefore, we have to have vision and take action. So to close, let me share these words from John Lewis that I find so powerful. You are a light. You are the light. Never let anyone, any person, or any force dampen, dim, or diminish your light. Study the path of others to make your way easier and more abundant. Lean toward the whispers of your own heart. Discover the universal truth and follow its dictates. Release the need to hate, to harbor division, and the enticement of revenge. Release all bitterness. Hold only love, only peace in your heart, knowing that the battle of good to overcome evil is already won. Choose confrontation wisely, but when it is your time, don't be afraid to stand up, and speak out against injustice. And if you follow your truth down the road to peace and the affirmation of love, if you shine like a beacon for all to see, then the poetry of all the great dreamers and philosophers is yours to manifest in a nation, a world community, and a beloved community that is finally at peace with itself. Thank you for this time to share. I hope the rest of this conference gives you the tools you need, along with the strength and courage required to help us transform our systems and our world into a place of true equity, justice, and belonging.
Michele, thank you so much, as always, for your words of care and love and wisdom. We all love and appreciate you more than I think you could possibly know. With that, folks, it is time for a break. Go take care of yourselves and others. And we will see you back at 10 o'clock for our next round of breakout sessions and then our final closing plenary.